All right, well, here we are. Welcome to session 3 as we are diving back in. So as we come back together from lunch, I want to spend some time after focusing on some really heavy realities in session 2. I want to start with some encouraging reassurance. Because when you start to grapple with many realities that we were talking about earlier, it's really easy for us to become quickly discouraged. See, when we are confronted with the need to change, as leaders, we can easily and quickly feel guilt, shame, and regret. That we haven't seen the need for change sooner, and or that we haven't made the necessary changes sooner than we actually have. So some of you at this point might feel somewhat overwhelmed or discouraged at the reality. But what I want to do is I want us to look at and find hope in the Apostle Peter's journey. So if you were to look at Acts 10, you find a key defining moment in the life of Peter. So here's Peter. Let's do a little backstory. Peter had the best discipleship process known to man. He literally walked and talked with Jesus for 3.5 years. I don't care what you list on the board or how creative your disciple-making pathway is, it's going to fall way short of what Peter got to experience. But despite the fact that Peter had all of that, it didn't preclude him from the massive failure that he encountered when Jesus went to the cross. He still denied and abandoned his master at his most critical hour. Then we arrive at John 21, and we get to see this restorative moment between Jesus and Peter. And Jesus then tells Peter, I'm not done with you. Feed my sheep, feed my lambs. And Peter went on to be greatly used by God and had huge ministry fruit. I mean, you think about it, Acts chapter 2, 3,000 people came to Christ after Peter gave the sermon at Pentecost. Acts chapter 5, we're told that the Spirit was so powerfully working through Peter that Peter's shadow would fall on people and they were healed. Then we arrive at Acts chapter 10. Peter has a dream. The sheep comes down from heaven and God tells him, don't call unclean what I've called clean. Peter has this wake-up call. He goes to the house of Cornelius, crossing social boundaries, and Cornelius and his entire household come to Christ in this defining moment in Peter's journey. Well, if you were to just read and chronicle Peter's story at face value, you might miss the reality that this moment in Acts chapter 10 actually occurred 10 to 15 years after Pentecost. So here's Peter. He has been following Jesus for 13 to 18 years at this point. He's been leading in the early church for over a decade. And in Acts chapter 10, at that point, Peter finally realizes, oh wait, the gospel and the Holy Spirit are for all people, not just for Jews. Wow. If Peter could be that misinformed, that misaligned, if Peter could be that far off track, given the fact that he walked and talked with Jesus and experienced all of the Spirit's working in him and through him, even at 13 to 18 years into his journey, if that's where Peter was at, have grace for yourself. We put so much pressure and we implode with this insecurity inside of us that we need to get and do everything right away. But the process of sanctification, being and becoming more like Jesus, having Jesus working in us and through us, it's a process. and it's a journey. So here's the thing. You've not been doing it all wrong. You've not. You might be tempted to feel that way at times, but you've seen fruit. Maybe it's just that you're starting to realize the fruit that you've seen has just been incomplete in view of the goal of Great Commission multiplication. See, I don't want to call you out where you wallow in guilt, shame, despair, and regret. I want to call you up to something so much better, to a vision for disciple-making multiplication. And what I love over lunch is just hearing the hunger and the drive that so many of you have for that. So if you're starting to feel a hunger for that, here are 3 key shifts for multiplication and movement. Shift number 1 is from the role of shepherding to the goal of shepherding. So think of King David. Before he was king, he was a shepherd. And think of the role that David had in tending for his father's flock. What are some of the things that you think David's role as a shepherd entailed? Shout them out. Feed the sheep. What else? Protect. What was that? Chasing sheep. Yep. What else? What else did David's role as a shepherd entail? Watching out for wolves. Yep. Absolutely. Bears and lions as well. Fight those off. That's good. How about a couple more? Leading. Yes. What else? Sacrifice. Absolutely. Give me one more. Oh, there's 2. Go ahead. You better feed them. Clean them. Absolutely. See, when I entered into ministry with this perspective on shepherding, I believed that my goal in shepherding was to protect, provide, lead, and guide the sheep. After all, the Bible has a lot to say about sheep and shepherds, both in the Old and New Testament. We mentioned earlier, John 21, Peter has this restorative moment. And what does Jesus tell him to do? Feed my sheep, feed my lambs, feed my sheep. So protect, provide, lead, and guide. Well, that's the role of a shepherd. That's not the goal of shepherding. The goal of shepherding is multiplication. Think of Genesis 30. We see this moment between Jacob and Laban. So Jacob takes all the spotted, speckled, and black sheep from Laban and then becomes immensely wealthy. How? By intentionally breeding and multiplying his flocks over time. Part of the role of shepherd is breeding to accomplish the goal of shepherding, which is multiplying flocks. See, if David had gone out with his father's flock for 9 months and returned home without any pregnant sheep, do you think his father would have been happy? No, because that flock would have died out under his care. Because without any pregnant sheep, you don't have any future generations, which means that eventually you will no longer have a flock. So for us, there's a big difference between the day-to-day role of the shepherd and all of the tasks that go with it to accomplish the ultimate goal of shepherding, which was multiplication. Beyond that, another role a shepherd has is selling wool. And they would shear the sheep for that. Shearing the sheep would actually produce more wool growth, which led to more profit for the shepherd. So Peter was actually well acquainted with the realities of shepherding in a highly agricultural society, and he knew the necessity of multiplication. Because see, when we hear Jesus say, feed my sheep, feed my lambs, we think that our primary goal in ministry is to feed people with Scripture. We then assume that if we just protect, provide, lead, and guide, that multiplication will just naturally happen. But maybe you're here today because that's not been working for you in your ministry, just like it wasn't working for me in my ministry either. Because I had a watershed moment where I realized that I could be 100% engaged in my role as a shepherd and totally failing at the goal of multiplication with the flock that God had entrusted to me. See, as shepherds, there are times that you might be tempted to think, I have some of the fattest sheep because I feed them so well with some rich, deep, theologically concentrated sermons that I labor over for 15 to 25 hours per week. Okay, well, let's unpack that for a minute. Let's look at the problem with fat, unsheared sheep. We've all heard that sheep are dumb, right? All right. So, do you know what happens if a sheep falls down on its side? Does anybody know? Can't get back up. That's right. It doesn't have the equilibrium as a fat, unsheared sheep. Its legs are short, and if it's sheared, it can maneuver its way back up. But a fat or unsheared sheep is stuck there, which begins a process called casting. See, casting is when the sheep's organs are squished. Their breathing becomes labored until they eventually suffocate and die in that debilitating state. That's why at times we see the necessity of shepherds helping the sheep to get back up. But it's the fat sheep that are the most vulnerable. First from casting, and second from wolves. Think about how this plays out in our churches. Some of our longest standing people are spiritually fat by being educated far beyond their obedience. And we've actually told them that's okay, because we've confused the role of shepherding with the goal of shepherding. This is how you can have somebody who is 80 years old, been in church since they were an infant, knows the Bible better than some of us, but still operates in spiritual infancy. Because somewhere along the way, they became idle in their knowledge, they did not exercise that knowledge through obedience, and they haven't multiplied into anyone spiritually. This is what happens when we confuse the role of shepherding with the goal of shepherding. We need to be leaders who equip people to be who God has called them to be, to do what God has called them to do. And that will lead toward multiplication if we're intentional to pursue that goal with them. See, here's how our shepherding process is broken. When we confuse the role with the goal, and we're not teaching people how to obey to the point of reproduction, it's like we've almost structured our churches to be like the best steakhouse in town. You go, and you eat amazing food. You have an incredible experience, but then you're left starving the rest of the week. The American Bible Society just put out last year that only 45% of Christians say they read their Bible at least once per week. Less than half of the people in the flocks that have been entrusted to us are engaging in Scripture without us. And while they might miss a week in the Bible, 68% of people never miss a day on social media. So we need to think of ourselves more as breeders rather than feeders. Because our job is to teach people to feed themselves biblically and then teach people to reproduce spiritually. And when we realign ourselves with the goal of shepherding, now everything we do in our role as shepherds is pointed at the ultimate goal of multiplication. That's shift number one. Shift number two for multiplication and movement is from pastor-teacher to mentor-modeler. Some of us have wrongly believed that discipleship happens primarily through preaching sermons on Sunday mornings. Others of us have wrongly believed that classes, programs, dream teams, and small groups will automatically produce healthier disciples. Let's explore that for a minute. Let's take the example of preaching. Many of us have operated that is, if I get up in front of my people and I clearly tell them what to do, I give them a compelling why, give them a practical tool, and explain it in a memorable way, then they'll go out the doors and they'll do it. Now, hear me clearly. I'm all about preaching. I preach 70% of the sermons at Restored each year. But what we ultimately find is that you teach what you know, but you reproduce who you are. That was my problem. That's why that fishermen who don't fish parable rocked me. Because I taught what I knew, I reproduced who I was. So if that's the case, we have to ask, how many hours a week do we spend preparing sermons and lessons? Versus how many hours a week do you spend with people? And if you're spending more time in your week away from people than with people, then it would be really easy to operate as a pastor teacher from a distance rather than a mentor modeler up close. See, as I've walked this journey, part of making this shift was I intentionally repurposed about 4 to 6 hours of my week for mentoring, modeling, and coaching disciple makers. And I will tell you, that has been significantly more fruitful than probably any sermon I've ever labored over in my entire life. See, you might say, I don't know about that, 4 to 6 hours. I don't know if I have time for that. Well, to be honest, short term does take time, and it does take a reprioritization of time. But long term, when you make the shift from pastor, teacher to mentor, modeler, you now have multiple generations of people who don't just have the beliefs and skills. They now put it into practice and have been taught it in a reproducible way where they become mentors on the field with the next generation. This is why the idea of apprenticeship is so crucial. See, at its core, a disciple is an apprentice of Jesus. This is why Paul says, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. This is why we see Paul say with the church of Thessalonica, because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our very lives as well. See, an apprentice replicates what their master does and says. It was never about knowledge alone. See, if I was a carpenter, I could teach you about wood, nails, saws, drills. I could show you pictures of finished products, of furniture. But if you were aspiring to be a carpenter, you would say, that's great. I understand about those things, but can you give me the tools, teach me how to use them so that I can produce that just like you do one day? See, if a carpenter has never built something, they're not a carpenter yet. You'd rather hear a carpenter say, I spent 5 years with a carpenters union that taught me with hands-on experience how to build a house, which then prepared me to be able to go on and do it without them watching over my shoulder. Along with that, if a brain surgeon has never operated on someone, you don't want to be there first, right? You'd rather hear a brain surgeon say, I've spent time under 5 skilled doctors who taught me how to do this procedure today, and I'm going to do it with them right beside me to guide me. In the same way, for you and I to make this shift as leaders from pastor, teacher to mentor, modeler, you should not primarily operate like a sage on a stage. You should primarily operate like a guide on the side. This is a picture of our Timothy Initiative Leadership Development Circle. And this is how it would work. Step 1 is you do, they watch. Followed by step 2, you do, and they help. Step 3, they do, you help. By the time you get to step 4, they do, you watch. And by the time you get to step 5, they do it without you. And reproduce this process with the next generation that goes far beyond what you could ever have the capacity for. It's fascinating. In a study that was done of how adults learn, this is what they found. 70% of adults learn best by doing. On-the-job training, trial and error. 20% learn best by interaction, things like feedback and coaching. And only 10% of people learn best by listening. In a conference setting like this, or a course you might take in an educational institution. But despite that reality, it seems as if over 70% of our ministry is normally devoted to teaching and listening environments, maybe 20% is devoted to interactions and things like small groups or Sunday school, and likely less than 10% is devoted to practical, hands-on experience that goes beyond the boundary of the church property. We've created content-driven ministry models that simply aren't producing the obedience and transformation that the Bible calls us to. Let me illustrate this for you. Think for a minute of the top 5 sermons that have impacted your life. You've likely sat through hundreds of sermons and thousands of hours of preaching in your years and decades in church. So think about the top 5 sermons that have impacted your life. What was the passage they preached, the illustration they used, that catchy tool they put in your hands? What was the joke that they told? Think of the top 5 sermons that have impacted your life. Well, as people who give and hear sermons regularly, can anybody in this room come up with 5? So of those of us who regularly give and hear and live in the land of sermons, can't think of the top 5 sermons that have impacted our lives. Okay, let me give you an easier one. Think of the top 5 people that have impacted your life. It's a whole lot easier and a whole lot quicker to come up with that list, right? See, we need to shift from being pastor, teacher to mentor, modeler that people would quickly include in their top 5 people who have impacted their life. Shift number 3, from knowledge to obedience. As we think about all this, there's an underlying question that we're asking. What is success in discipling others? Is it a transfer of knowledge? Is it a completion of a curriculum? Is it a theological threshold of doctrinal prowess? Or is it something more? Well, according to Matthew 28 in the Great Commission, Jesus actually told us teaching is not the goal. He said teaching them to obey is the goal I'm giving you with the disciples you make and baptize. Knowledge is the foundation, but obedience is the goal. There are many people that are taught biblical knowledge, but they aren't always taught how to obey. Education and discipleship operate in vastly different arenas. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Knowledge isn't bad, but love is knowledge in action. See, a contrast is that knowledge-based discipleship emphasizes the accumulation of information and is heavy on theological and theoretical concepts. Whereas obedience-based discipleship stresses the pairing of knowing with doing. What is learned is intended to be applied and also trained to others. There have been many people who have been educated in the church, but very few people have been discipled by their church to become disciple-making disciples. Knowledge is the foundation, but obedience is the goal. Think of the words of Jesus when he was here. Matthew chapter 7, he draws this picture of the person who builds their house on the rock and the person who builds their house on the sand. What's the difference? The foundation. What about that foundation? What did Jesus liken that foundation to? What was that? Hearing and doing. Jesus said, whoever hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. But whoever hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. In some of his parting teaching to his disciples, John 15, Jesus was pretty clear. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. Then the best friend of Jesus, John, the apostle, goes on and writes in 1 John, he tells us repeatedly, for this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. We must make the shift from knowledge to obedience. I love how Pastor Craig Groeschel talks about in his leadership, they have a forbidden phrase. The forbidden phrase for them is we don't say people can't, people don't, or people won't. We say we've not led them to. I heard him say that years ago. I've never been able to forget that because there are times where I'm tempted to say, well, people don't make disciples. People won't share the gospel. People can't do this. But what I eventually had to come to grips with is that for a large season of my ministry, it wasn't them. It was me. I did not lead my people to be disciple-making disciples. See, let me illustrate how teaching people to the point of obedience often breaks down for us. If you went to your church this next Sunday and you said, how many of you believe that you need a personal relationship with Jesus to go to heaven? Probably 90% of hands in the room go up. And you're glad the other 10% of people are there exploring faith. Okay, so 90% of the hands go up. Okay, since you believe that, how many of you shared Jesus with people this week? Almost all of the hands go down. Why? Well, it's not a belief issue. They know it and they believe it. It's either a skill issue, they don't know how, or they're too scared to do it, or it's a value issue. They've assigned more value to someone or something else. See, you could have the best expository sermon in the world on why people should share the gospel, but your people still say, I don't know how, and I'm really scared. So maybe you shift away from that and you go, okay, well, let's shift our teaching to be more practical. Let's say you do a really practical sermon or sermon series to help with this, and you teach them the 3 circles and the Romans road and the 4 spiritual laws and the bridge illustration. And you go, okay, end of the series. How many of you believe that Jesus is the only way to God? 90% of the hands go up. Okay, how many of you know how to share that good news with somebody else? 90% of the hands in the room stay up. Okay, so since you know it and you believe it and we've taught you how to do it, how many of you have done that in the course of this series? Almost every hand in the room goes down. Why? Because of fear. So the question then becomes, we don't need to blame them for their fear. We shouldn't trivialize or minimize their fear. The question for us, if we're thinking through that I've not led them to paradigm, is, okay, how do I help them overcome the fear that's stopping them from having conversations with others about Jesus? Modeling and mentoring is a key component that's oftentimes missing from our skill development. See, we model in our teaching, but we mentor in the field. You have to practically show them how to do it in real life situations by actually going with them. Here's what's interesting. Ask your people to practice sharing the gospel with another believer, and they're still terrified. If we're afraid to do it with people who already believe it and agree with us, how much scarier is it to do it with people who don't? But practice manages fear, builds confidence, and sharpens performance. So to shift from knowledge to obedience, you have to model and practice with them many times and then mentor in the field. Now again, think back to that fisherman who don't fish very well. It is so foundational. Because if you don't do it at the beginning, nobody else will. If you don't have any real life stories, you don't have anything to say to their real life struggles. So it starts not with them, but with us, taking personal ownership of being a disciple maker. If we want to make disciples who make disciples, we have to first start by making disciples ourselves and integrating that as a core reality and rhythm in our lives. It takes disciple-making pastors to reproduce disciple-making people. So we have to first look inward and ask, in my life, in my family, in my schedule, in my value system, in my lifestyle, am I committed to making disciples above all else? Because we can never call other people to do what we ourselves aren't willing to do firsthand. And here's the great thing. when you take personal ownership of it, it like flows out of you contagiously because you're so excited for how God's working and how he's moving and how he's changing. You start to infectiously impact people just by the stories you're telling, the life that you're living. They're seeing it up close and personal, and then you get to invite them to do it alongside of you. And then you get to step out of your environment and step into their environment and help them to do it as well. See, we have to be holistic in discipling people in beliefs, skills, and values. We need to help people deepen their beliefs. We need to help them sharpen their skills. And we need to help them realign their values with a disciple-making lifestyle that is sold out for the Great Commission. See, what you find as you walk through this is that everything you do and don't do has implications for multiplication and movement. If you only engage in the role of shepherding, to protect, provide, lead, and guide, you never engage in the goal of shepherding, which is multiplication, which means that most of the ministry fruit you see will die in the generation it began. If you primarily operate as a pastor teacher and only lead people from a distance with your words, they will miss the opportunity to apprentice under you as you help them put those things into action. If you primarily focus on knowledge, then you will have highly educated people whose knowledge far exceeds their obedience as they continue to prioritize the accumulation of more knowledge, not deeper obedience. Now, to be clear, those things will produce addition. They'll just fall short of the multiplication that Jesus called us to. Those things are not reproducible to multiple generations to actually see movement happen. So with that in view, let's think about some key guiding principles for multiplication. Number one is that process matters more than content. While there's a wide variety of great content available on making disciples and discipleship, it often doesn't lead to multiplication because it isn't structured around a reproducible process that can be passed on to future generations. That's why TTI has curated and refined a reproducible process, which invests in putting things into practice and seeing multiple generations raised up through our training process. But let me encourage you, don't do what I did. I talked to the TTI team. I got really excited. I bought the book, and I just started going through it with a guy in our church. I took him all the way through it and then realized I did everything wrong. Why? Well, because I prioritized content over process and knowledge over obedience. So the guy I discipled knew a whole lot more, but he didn't put those things into practice because I didn't help him do that. That's the second key principle. Obedience-based, accountability-driven. Knowledge is the foundation, but obedience is the goal. See, knowledge without practice produces pride and dryness. At the same time, practice without increased knowledge leaves one weak in the faith. But knowledge and practice not imparted to the next generation dies in the generation where it began. That's why all of the training materials produced by TTI are not merely for educational purposes. Every disciple maker is expected to put into practice what they learn from the content and trains others to do the same. Third is evangelism and discipleship should not be separated. Evangelism and discipleship are two sides of the same disciple-making coin. When we focus only on evangelism, we make converts but not disciples. And those people then often are left in spiritual infancy for years, if not decades. In contrast, when we focus only on discipleship, we produce godlier character and better church members, but not disciple makers. This is also really big for our people to take full ownership of the disciple-making process that Jesus called us to in the Great Commission, to make disciples, baptize them, and teach them to obey everything Jesus commanded. If they don't do this, then rather than engaging in disciple-making, they say, well, I'm not really good at sharing my faith, so I'll just bring my friends to church so my pastor can share the gospel for me. Or rather than discipling a person they led to Christ, they just bring them to church for us to do it for them. That's why for us, we make a distinction between discipling and disciple maker. Discipling is defined as helping existing believers grow in their faith with an emphasis on biblical knowledge, spiritual disciplines, engaging in serving others, and leading and encouraging others who are already in the body of Christ. But disciple makers are those who are involved in discipling, but also engaged in bringing lost people to Christ and continuing to lead them in relationships that result in the reproduction of the next generation. Which is why the fourth principle matters. Everything must be easily reproducible for the next generation. Education, intuition, and experience are not easily reproducible. And oftentimes in ministry, that's what you and I are tempted to rely on: our education, our intuition, and our experience. But when we do that, it erodes disciple making to future generations. That's why we believe everything we do should be clearly and easily reproducible for future generations, because our success is measured through the success of our disciples and the generations beyond. Let me tell you a story of a pastor who made these shifts and applied these principles. This is my friend Bill. I met Bill a couple years ago in a room just like this. Bill was somebody who had a huge passion for discipleship. Somewhere along the way, like me, he encountered TTI, bought the books, and was doing it on his own for a few years. When I met Bill, he was discipling 18 different men one-on-one. Okay, can we just acknowledge the immense discipleship capacity that Bill had? I don't know about you, but I've never come close to discipling 18 different people one-on-one. This guy is incredible. But because he only used the content, and he didn't understand or engage the reproducible, obedience-based, accountability-driven process, he saw really limited fruit in the lives of those he was discipling. And none of those people ever went on to reproduce in the life of anybody else. So 2 years ago, Bill engaged in an environment like this, and Bill joined one of our 2-year TTI leadership cohorts. And a couple months ago, I was out to lunch with Bill, shortly after he graduated from our cohort, and I asked Bill, hey, I'm curious, looking back, what changed between when we met 2 years ago and where you're at today? He said, it's interesting. I walked into TTI exhausted because I was pouring myself out one-on-one, investing in 18 different men. He said, but I recently sat down and I totaled it up, and I'm no longer influencing just 18 people. I'm now influencing over 100 people weekly between the people I'm training and the groups I'm leading and the people they're training and the groups that they're leading. And now God has moved Bill to the place where he has a passion for planting disciple-making churches in every small town in Pennsylvania. Because he took those 3 shifts seriously. He took those principles and he applied them, and he experienced the fruit of them in powerful ways for the sake of the kingdom. See, the Timothy Initiative gets its name from 2 Timothy 2:2. It says, and the things which you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust these to faithful people who will be able to teach others also. So what started with Paul multiplied to Timothy, who entrusted those things to faithful people who would be able to teach others also. We see 4 generations pictured there. But there's a key word in this verse that is the linchpin of multiplication. Do you know what it is? What's the key word, the one word in this verse that everything else hinges on? Others? What was that? Able. Getting closer. What was that? Faithful. Exactly. Faithful. See, in our disciple-making efforts, the invitation is to all, but the investment is in the faithful. The invitation is to all, but the investment is in the faithful. So I want to illustrate for you how a movement spreads. So shortly before this session, I passed out a small number of these yellow sheets of paper. If you got one of these yellow sheets of paper, could you go ahead and stand up and hold this paper up in the air? All right? Somebody's got to help Marcus out because I gave one to him and he left. There you go. Go ahead and stand up. Stand up with that piece of paper. There you go. All right, so the 7 of you represent the first generation of a movement. Now, here's what I want you to do. Have your paper vertically, fold it in half, crease it. It's cardstock, so you got to work a little hard at it. Rip it in half, and take this half sheet of paper, walk away from your table, and give this to somebody else who is currently sitting. Go ahead and do that. Take this half sheet of paper, walk away from your table, and hand this to somebody else who is currently sitting. And when you get one of these pieces of paper, go ahead and join your friends in standing as they return to their seat. If you just received one of these pieces of paper, you now represent the second generation of a movement. So, like the people before, turn your paper vertically, fold it in half, rip it in half, and go find somebody else apart from your table that is currently sitting that you want to hand one of these sheets of paper to. All right, so everybody in the room, go ahead, grab one of these, and grab somebody else. Hand it to somebody else. There you go. All right, and if you receive one of these pieces of paper, go ahead and join these people in standing as they return to their seats. If you just received one of these pieces of paper, you represent the third generation of a movement. If you're holding one of these now tiny pieces of paper in your hand, turn it vertically, fold it in half, rip it in half, and give it to anybody else in the room who is not yet standing. All right, and when you receive one of these pieces of paper, go ahead and join the rest of the room in standing. Some of you might have some leftovers, that's okay. Because we've now reached saturation, where the movement has now saturated the room. See, when you think about multiplying to the fourth generation, it starts with you, it then spreads to your people, who then take it to their people, who then take it to their connections. See, what started with a small minority of just 7 people in this room of almost 50 people, saturated the entire room by the time we reached the fourth generation. Now, thinking back to 2 Timothy 2:2, where we see a picture of this. Does anybody remember, what's the key word of 2 Timothy 2:2? Faithful. Faithful. Can you guys all say that together? Faithful. See, if the first generation had taken this and just hid it in their pocket, the movement would have died with them, and the room would have never been saturated. If the second generation took this, considered it, and then threw it away, well, the movement would have died with them. If the third generation, upon receiving this, had decided that they were going to give something else higher priority that distracted them from this, then the generational fruit would have died with them, and we would have never saturated the room. So here's what I want you to think about right now. Who are your people? Who are the lost people in your life that you need to have a spiritual conversation with shortly after you go back home? And I don't want you to think about how difficult or awkward that conversation is. Rather, I want you to think beyond the difficulty of the conversation. I want you to envision the fruit that could come from it. If you lead them to Christ and train them as a disciple maker, and then they go and reach their people and train them as a disciple maker, and then those people who you don't even know at this point, then go and reach their connections and train them as disciple makers. That all starts with one key linchpin word found in the middle of 2 Timothy 2:2, which is entrust these things to faithful people who will teach others also. So the question for you and I becomes, what will you do with what has been entrusted to you? Will you be faithful with the relationships and opportunities that God has placed all around you? And what implications does your action or passivity not just have on your life, but on your people and on their people and on their connections? So on that piece of paper that you're holding, I want you to grab a pen, and I want you to write the name of someone in your community that you want to see come to Christ. Right now, grab a pen, and on this sheet of paper, I want you to write the name of someone in your community that you desperately want to see come to Christ. Then I want you to take this piece of paper home, and I want you to put it somewhere that will consistently remind you to pray for and pursue that person. And I want you to pray, not just that they would come to Christ, but that they would be reached and trained to reach and train many more people who will reach and train many more people as well. So here's what I want us to do. I want all of us to stand again. And right where you stand, I want you to pause, and I want you to pray right now that God will use you as a disciple maker to make a disciple who makes a disciple with whoever you wrote on that piece of paper. Right where you stand, take a minute and pray by name for that person right now.